Okay.
Great. I want to just say good morning to everyone. We are continuing in our learning on Franz Rosenzweig, but being that it is Tanit Esther and the day before, I don't know, everybody here probably is Yerushalayim. So for us, it's not the day before Purim, but it's at least Erev Purim. So what I wanted to do is use the Megillah to sort of get at some of the themes that we have been exploring in the thought of Rosenzweig. Because in some ways, the Franz Rosenzweig doesn't write explicitly about the Megillah. It's a tiny bit about Purim and the Star of Redemption. It's not a major focus, and it's not at all. Like he says very little about these things, but there's something very powerful about the way the story of the Megillah reflects something very profound about Rosenzweig's thought. And this gets at this idea that we've been speaking about now for weeks, which is that Rosenzweig is trying to carve a path that is neither Orthodox nor Reform. He wants to envision a Judaism that is neither Orthodox nor Reform, and that is radical because in the context in which he lives, in which he finds himself, and to a large extent the same context that we ourselves find ourselves in today, right? The only options are basically Orthodoxy or Reform. And again, I'm using Orthodoxy and Reform as very general terms. Orthodoxy, we might call it religious fundamentalism, for maybe the worst version of it. And for Reform, it means, again, almost just secularism, right? We basically push back God as far as we can go until maybe there's nothing left. And in terms of these two, the metaphors we've been using to describe sort of each of these positions that Rosenzweig is continually polemicizing against, I've been saying that Orthodoxy represents the idol. It represents this notion that we can know exactly what God wants. We can know exactly what God is. Right. And it's going to be that way, unchanging forever. That is the Orthodox position. And that like all idols, God embodies a great power, and we have to submit ourselves before that power, that ideal. That is one extreme. The other extreme, right, which again, we've been saying is the metaphor for Reform, is that of the mirror, right? That when the Reform Jew, and again, I'm using these broadly. I feel like I have to clarify that every time I say the term, because I'm not speaking about, people or movements per se. But for the Reform Jew, the problem is that when they look into the Torah, it's as if they are looking at themselves. They only find in it what they want to find in it, that affirms their own, sensibilities and understandings. And again, the problem with both Orthodoxy as the idol and Reform as the mirror is that neither one is in a real relationship with God, Torah, or the Jewish people, right? Because what's placed on the other side is always something artificial, essentially, something that actually blocks us from having a real relationship with God, Torah, and the Jewish people. Now, what's fascinating about the Megillah is that the Megillah seems to sort of understand these dynamics, and you can see when you look closely at it how there's an Orthodox reading of the Megillah, a Frum reading of the Megillah, and a Reform, like a secular reading of the Megillah. And they're both wrong, right? And they're both fundamentally wrong. So I want to show how that's going to play out and try to show how the Megillah is offering an alternative that I see as very much being at the heart of how Rosenzweig envisions what it means to be a religious person in the modern era. So let me just, whoops, wait a second. Let me just share this. Okay, just one second. All right. So let's articulate the secular reading of the Megillah, the Reform reading of the Megillah. So when a secular Jew, I mean, I have some answers here, but let me just open it up to people as well. So feel free to unmute. If you want to read the Megillah as a secular text, what is it about that text that basically affirms that kind of reading? Meaning, if we want to read the text as secular, what is it about the text that affirms that kind of reading? I've already given one answer there. It's on the top of the list, so we'll just maybe start with that, right? The most glaring answer as to why we can read the Megillah as if God is absent is because God is absent in the Megillah, right? God's name does not appear in the Megillah in any form whatsoever, right? I think we all are aware of this. It's one of the central ideas behind the Megillah, right? So if you want to read the Megillah as a secular narrative, as a narrative of the history of the Jewish people, meaning like here's an event that took place to Jews, that doesn't have to inherently be religious or have anything to do with God. One is certainly within reason, able to do that, right? And just to continue to play that up a bit more, what are some of the themes of the Megillah that resonate very strongly with the secular Jewish experience, particularly as we understand it in modernity, right? What is it about the Megillah that makes it very much a secular Jewish story that we're familiar with?
People hate us and want to kill us.
Good, right? So that was the next point on here, right? This idea that even without the religious dimension, right, people still hate the Jews, right? Now, what's fascinating about this is that we know later on, particularly, again, the Megillah takes place, during the Bayit Sheni, essentially during the early Second Temple period. But we know already later on, once the Jews are in exile, once the Jews are especially living in Europe, anti-Semitism is primarily a religious phenomenon, right? Who hates the Jews? The Christians hate the Jews. And the Christians have very clear theological reasons why they hate the Jews, right? And there's a religious conflict on a certain level between Judaism and Christianity, particularly throughout most of the last 2 centuries in Europe. What's fascinating is that with the modern period, what we've seen is that even without Christian anti-Semitism or Christian theologically fueled anti-Semitism still exists. It still continues. And the Megillah seems to get at that in a really very powerful way, right? There's the famous line that Haman says to Achashverosh. This is when he is setting up his plot to basically take revenge on Mordechai, but really to take revenge in a way that he's going to kill all the Jews. And what does Haman say to Achashverosh? Ve'amar Haman l'melech Achashverosh, Yeshno am echad mifuzar mifarad ben ha'amim. Right, he says to Achashverosh, there's this one nation spread out amongst all the peoples. B'chol medinot malchutecha, in all the provinces of your kingdom. V'datehem shonot mikolam, v'datehem melech inam osim. And this is a little difficult to translate, but it says, how does it translate it here? It says, their laws are different from those of any other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. Now, the reason I say this is it's a little difficult to translate is when it says vidatehem shonot, dot here doesn't have to mean religion. That's why it's not translated as religion. It's translated here as laws. So in this sense, it's not that Haman is saying, well, they're a different religion. Therefore, there's a problem with them. What Haman is really saying is that when he says they're datehem or shonot, it means they act differently. They seem to act according to their own set of rules, and that makes them different or perhaps even rebellious, disloyal to the king of Persia, because Jews do their own thing. Now, again, what's fascinating about this text is when we think about modern anti-Semitism, particularly in the early 20th century leading up to the Holocaust, it was not necessarily fueled by this, again, deep theological commitments. It was fueled by a sensibility that Jews were somehow different. And we don't need God to explain that difference, right? The Jews are not told that they're different here because God chose them, right? Oftentimes, again, theological anti-Semitism is, well, the Jews are God's chosen people, and that makes us other nations angry at us because we think we're special, right? That's not even what's going on here. This is a purely secular formulation that just says people hate the Jews because the Jews are different, because they act a little bit differently, because they think a little bit differently, but without even having to get into any sort of religious notion of that. And certainly today, with the rise of anti-Semitism, again, particularly in North America and Europe, right? Almost all of the anti-Semitism one finds today in North America, it's not theological. It's not like Christian anti-Semitism. It's clear. I mean, I'm not saying it on some level isn't influenced by that, but the outward manifestations of it are clearly secular, right? What are the tropes that are used in anti-Semitism today, right? And as it's in its resurgence in the last decade or so. Anybody know? Like, what are the kinds of things that are pointed to?
We control the banks. We control the media. We control the government behind the scenes. The Zionists make Washington decide to do whatever they want to do. It's like there's a cabal. It's almost like the protocols of the elders of Zion, back to that model from the late 19th, early 20th century.
Good. And what all of those have to do with is about power. There's a perception that Jews have some sort of unfair power or a hidden or secret power that makes them either subversive or manipulative or responsible for the suffering that a lot of people are experiencing. Again, nothing inherently theological about that at all. right? Which is just showing us that anti-Semitism doesn't need theology to thrive. And of course, the Megillah is the first to make that very, very, very clear for us. So we have no God, right? God's name doesn't appear in the text. You can read it as a completely secular text, right? We see this, what we would almost call modern anti-Semitism. And then the other major theme of the Megillah, or the other two themes, I'll pair them together, that again, make it deeply, sort of modern and even a secular modern reading, is that because God is absent in the text, and when it's clear that the Jews are at the edge of catastrophe, then what do the Jewish people have to do, right? They cannot stand idly by and wait for God to save them. What the Jewish people have to do is they have to take responsibility for themselves, which is, again, a very, very powerful modern idea in a sense. And again, if God's not there, we have to step in. And we see this at least in a variety of ways, but certainly primarily through the actions of Mordechai, right? We know that Mordechai dons sackcloth and is crying out once the decree of Ahasuerus is issued. But we also know that he's trying to arouse people's concern. And he actually has this whole plan to go to the gates so he can sort of get word to Esther, because he realizes she may be the only one who can intervene and save the Jewish people. And then, of course, Esther's own intervention, right, is what ultimately is the trigger point for the salvation of the Jewish people. She goes to Ahasuerus when she's not supposed to, right? She is the one who hatches the plot of the multiple seudot, the meals where she's going to invite Haman and Ahasuerus. She's the one who's going to have to say to Ahasuerus, I'm a Jew, and this wicked Haman wants to kill me and my people, right? There's a tremendous amount of human initiative and responsibility that takes place here, because again, there's a sense the Jewish people can't rely on anyone but themselves. So that's another, again, I would say very important secular theme. And the fourth point that is also very clear here in the verses is the notion of Jewish solidarity, right? The Jews have to stick together. The Jews are connected to one another, even when they're spread out, and that we manifest that solidarity with a sense of shared responsibility and concern. I'm responsible for my fellow Jew. I care about my fellow Jew. And this manifests very, very clearly when Esther finally agrees to go to Ahasuerus. She tells Mordechai, okay, Mordechai, here's what you got to do. You have to organize the Jewish people to come together, and they're going to have to fast for 3 days. And it's this act of fasting where she's going to fast and they're going to fast. And that is this profound communal solidarity. The Jews are in this together, and they care about one another, and they are committed to each other. Now, what's fascinating is, again, when I read the Megillah, I was a shul rabbi for a number of years, and I spent a lot of time involved in the federation there. And again, there's probably like no better narrative to sort of capture sort of the secular Jewish ethos, particularly American ethos, that federations often try to propose than the story of Esther. Because again, all these themes, right? Anti-Semitism is real, whether you're religious or not, right? The fact that we have to be responsible for ourselves, and this idea that we're all bound to each other. We all have to stick together, right? These are very, very, very common themes that one finds today in a sort of secular Jewish orientation to the world. They're also in many ways the themes of Zionism too, I'll point out. That what you see here in many ways also reflects Zionism, right? Zionism is about Jews can't wait for God anymore. We have to take responsibility for ourselves. Zionism is about the recognition of anti-Semitism putting the Jews in a profoundly precarious position. And Zionism, of course, is about this collective identity, right? We are all in this together as Jews, and therefore we are responsible to each other. And we should actually try to build a society together. And again, from the secular perspective, right, the Megillah is a wonderful success story for the Jewish people, right? Rather than be, again, vulnerable, passive, subject to, the powers that are, greater than us, we actually can take our destiny into our own hands, and we can be successful. And that through that success, Judaism can be sustained, right? The Jews survive, the Jews thrive. People want to be Jewish because of the success, right? That's the way Megillah ends. There's a notion that even the Persians, some of them want to become Jewish. So there's a very interesting secular read to this book, more so than any other book in the entire Tanakh. I'm not sure any book in the Tanakh can be read in a purely secular fashion. Esther can. It really, really, really can. And again, like I said before, this reading is in many ways prefaced on the fact that God is absent from the Megillah, right? We can look at it, and what do we find? we find ourselves. That's the claim I want to make here. Now, that is this, like I said, the secular reading of the Megillah. But there is a problem with the secular reading of the Megillah, just like there is a problem with this sort of, extreme of, like I said, the reform approach, the idea that when we open the Torah, we see a mirror, right? That God gets pushed away, right? What is the problem with that approach? Well, when you look closely at the Megillah, it actually seems that the Megillah is constantly hinting to religious ideas, but then seems to kind of cover them up. So what do I mean by this? What I mean is that the text itself subverts a purely secular reading. Even though God's name doesn't appear, it still subverts a secular reading. So let me just give you a few examples real quick. And these are examples, again, some of them are subtextual, meaning you have to know other books of the Tanakh. But for the reader who knows Tanakh, you come to the book of Esther, you're going to find again and again these moments where you think something religious should appear and it doesn't. And the fact that religion is constantly being suppressed, or God is constantly being suppressed, or the religious orientation is constantly being suppressed, is in some ways a problem for us. So the first example of this is, again, the question of why Mordechai refuses to bow, right? So the Megillah doesn't say why Mordechai refuses to bow. The only answer Mordechai gives is because he says, I am a Jew. That's why I don't bow to Haman. It's not much of an answer. It's not a very clear answer. Jews, we see elsewhere in Tanakh, can bow down before people. So why is it that Mordechai won't bow down to Haman? Well, if you look in Sefer Daniel, which is, again, what Book of Esther draws upon, because Daniel takes place in Babylonia before the Persian Empire conquers Babylonia. And if you're familiar with Daniel, what you'll know is that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylonia, sets up an idol and demands that everybody bow down to the idol. And there happen to be 3 Jews who are appointed in this particular place, who are appointed into some sort of position of leadership, who refuse to bow down to the king's idol. And again, if we're just looking at the parallels here, right? If you read the book of Esther and you see Mordechai won't bow down to Haman, right? Your natural assumption is, and I think this is true for everybody, that there's some religious reason here, right? The notion that Haman is demanding something that's idolatrous, or as the rabbis say, that Haman is like wearing an idol, or Haman is acting as if he's an idol, right? These are things that seem quite logical to us. But the fact that Megillah doesn't say that it completely suppresses any sort of religious dimension here is really kind of surprising to us. Why else would Mordechai not bow down, right? Like, this just reinforces the idea that Jews are disloyal. Like, why would we ever think such a thing? There has to be something more going on here, but the Megillah doesn't tell us. That's the first problem with the secular reading. Another problem with the secular reading is that we have this moment when the decree is issued where Mordechai does this very, very public set of actions as a response. Right? It says here, this is Esther 4, verse 1. Now, when Mordechai knew all was done, Mordechai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry. Right? Mordechai does what a Jew's supposed to do, right? When something bad is supposed to happen, right? We typically associate the tearing of the clothing, the ashes, the sackcloth, right? Those are acts that are typically associated with mourning, if you're familiar with it, right? So again, we already look at that and we see that, like, this looks like it's a religious activity. If it's not about religiosity or piety, why else would he do these things, right? And what's particularly striking is when you look at the book of Yonah, you see the same description playing out, right? Yonah comes to Nineveh, and Yonah tells the city of Nineveh, right, you're going to be overthrown in 40 days, right? Death and destruction is going to come for you, right? The same message the Jewish people have just gotten from Ahasuerus. And how do the people of Nineveh react here? So it says here, this is from Yonah chapter 3, verse 8. But let them be covered with sackcloth, both man and beast, and let them cry mightily unto God, right? That the acts of mourning are always connected to this turning towards God, right? And what's fascinating, again, if you look at the Megillah that we just saw, Mordechai puts on the sackcloth and ashes. He even cries out, but we're not even told who he cries to, right? What's exactly lacking there are those 3 words. It should say, and cry with a loud and bitter cry to God, right? The fact that it doesn't say that is very strange and weird, right? It's one thing to say God's name doesn't appear, but again, why is it that this religious inclination, this orientation is seemingly being suppressed? Like, why can't this be mentioned? Doesn't make any sense to read this verse if Mordechai isn't doing something that we would at least identify as religious. So that's the second example. The third example is that there are moments where it almost seems like the characters want to say, God is going to save the Jewish people. It's like they're just about to say the words and like something else is swapped in their mouths, right? So if you look at in Esther chapter 4, the famous verse from Mordechai to Esther, where he's basically trying to put it all out there and convince her to act. He says to her, this is verse 14, for if thou holdst thy peace at this time, if you, Esther, if you don't say anything, then will relief and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you came to the royal palace for such a time as this, right? So this verse, again, is sort of laden with like some notion of religiosity, right? Mordechai is affirming that even if Esther doesn't act, the Jews will still be saved. Salvation will come from another place. Now, what we would expect to see there is that what would we would expect Mordechai to say, right? If you don't act, right, God will still save the Jewish people, even though you, Esther, may be punished for your inaction. But again, it's so striking that it doesn't say that Mordechai doesn't invoke God here when he's still confident that salvation will come, right? Fascinating. And then again, in chapter 6, you see a similar notion. Haman returns home. And at this point, this is already after, I believe, the whole episode where he's been invited to the party, right? He sees Mordechai and he's so angry and upset because he can't be happy as long as he sees Mordechai. They build he decides he's going to build a gallows to hang Mordechai. And of course, before this can happen, there's this whole switcheroo where Ahasuerus decides he wants to reward Mordechai for Mordechai having saved the king's life. And that not only is Mordechai going to get the great reward, Haman is the one who's going to basically lead Mordechai around the city and to show honor to him, right? If before Mordechai wouldn't bow down to Haman, now we have Haman leading Mordechai around on a horse. And when Haman's wife hears this, she is just like, you know what, Haman, I'm sorry. Like, you're not going to win this. This is like, you're done. But here's how she says it. She says, Haman recounts to Zeresh, his wife, and his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, to him, if Mordechai, before whom thou hast begun to fall, be of the seed of the Jews, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shall surely fall before him. So what they're saying here is that the reason that Mordechai is going to defeat Haman is because Mordechai is from the seed of the Jews, Mizera Yehudim, right? It doesn't make any sense. Like, what does it matter that he's the seed from the Jews, seed of the Jews? Like the Jews, if you thought the Jews were so powerful and therefore you can't defeat them, well, guess what? They just had their temple destroyed and sent into exile. The Megillah tells us Mordechai was sent into exile. He's a refugee. He's not some great and powerful person representing a great and powerful people. So again, when we read this verse, what it seems to be hinting to is some greater power that stands behind the Jews. But again, it seems to be unwilling to come out and say it. And I just brought here how the Septuagint actually, again, just sort of says this clearly. Instead of saying that, okay, Mordechai is of the seed of the Jews and Haman can't defeat him, it literally says, I'll just read the verse in the Septuagint translation. His friends and his wife said to him, if Mordechai is of the Jewish people and you have begun to be humiliated before him, you will surely fall. You will not be able to defend yourself because the living God is with him. That's what we expect the Megillah to say. That's what the Septuagint thinks the Megillah should say, but that's not actually what we find in the Megillah, right? Again, it says if the religious dimension of the Megillah is being suppressed or repressed. And this is actually an idea that the Ibn Ezra states in his commentary on the Megillah. He is trying to grapple with why is it that God's name doesn't appear? Why is it that God's name doesn't appear in the Megillah? And here's the answer that he gives. He says, "V'hine ein b'Megillah hazot zecher Hashem." Right, God's name isn't mentioned. V'hi misifrei hakodesh v'rabim eshivu ki hu mimekom acher v'zeh einenu nachon. Right, he says many people want to argue God's name does appear in the Megillah. In that verse we read before from chapter 4, where Mordechai says salvation will still come from some other place, makom acher, and people want to claim, well, when it says makom acher, that's actually a reference to God, because in rabbinic literature, God is referred to as makom, as place. God is the place of the world. But Ibn Ezra doesn't like that explanation. Because God is never referred to as makom in the Tanakh. Only in rabbinic literature, that's much, much later. You can't, it's anachronistic to project it onto Tanakh. Rak shenikra ma'on shehu la'olam gavoa. V'kadmonenu karuhu makom b'avor shekol makom alei kavodo. Right? The rabbis refer to God as place because God's glory fills the entire world. V'od matam lemilat acher. Right? And if you want to say, well, makom is a reference to God, why does it say makom acher? right? That doesn't make sense. It's like some other God, like that doesn't work at all for this kind of reading. So here's Ibn Ezra's answer. He says, "V'nachon be'enai, shezot Megillah chibra Mordechai, v'zet tam b'yishlach svarim." What we have to understand the Megillah is that it was written by Mordechai. And we know this because the Megillah itself says this in the ninth chapter, that it is written, the Igeret Purim is written and sent out. Basically, an account of the historical account of the events is written by Mordechai and Esther and then sent out everywhere to the Jews and beyond. The Kulam Mishaneh Sefer Achad Shehu Megillah Ketam Patshegen Ve'tikuha Parsiim V'nichtava B'divrei Yamim Shel Malchehem. So here's what Ibn Ezra is saying. He's saying the Megillah, it looks like a secular text because it was actually written for the historical chronicles of Persia, right? Persia has their own historical chronicles, and this unique episode was written in it by Mordechai. And that's why it has a secular character to it, because it was for the Persians, essentially. And the Persians were idol worshippers. And if Mordechai was to include God's name in the Megillah, and then the Megillah was included in the historical chronicles of Persia, then you'd have God's name being included in a work that idolaters are going to use and read. And basically it means that God's name is going to come to be desecrated because of it. And therefore, Mordechai takes out God's name because of the fact that it's only going to really be used, at least publicly, by the non-Jews. Now, what Mordechai is essentially saying here is the version that we have of Esther is not the correct version of Esther, right? It is a repressed or censored version of Esther, right? That it is missing religious dimensions to it, specifically because they had to keep it out. Now, the reason I find this interpretation so interesting is that it basically is pushing back on the secular reading of the Megillah. You want to read the Megillah as a secular text, right? You Reform Jews, again, I know I'm just playing that up. You Reform Jews want to read it as a secular text. You only want to find in it what you want. You want to find this like secular Jewishness. We can keep God out of it, right? That doesn't really work, right? That requires you to repress certain things that we would know on some level need to be in there. That human beings have certain religious orientations. And in a certain sense, the Jewish story can't be made sense of without God, right? Like we saw before, Zera Yehudim, Makom Acher, right? There's no way to almost read this story without God almost breaking through. At least the character's thinking so, right? At least the character's thinking, okay, like God is in this some way or another. And in that sense, to read the Megillah and assume it is only a secular text is to also encounter a text that pushes against that reading. If you're looking really closely at it, you realize that reading can't be fully sustained. And that's always the problem with the sort of reading of Judaism that seeks to push God away, is that it always has to cut things out. We've talked about this, right? Like you always have to cut it out to make it look, how you want, to make it look like you. And in that sense, it is, the Megillah is trying to show us you can't really ever get away with that. Anytime you try to cut verses out of the Torah you don't like, what's still left behind, right? The empty spaces where those verses used to be. And the same is true with God. If you want to try to imagine Judaism without God, right, you want to try to cut out a big hole in the middle of Judaism. At a certain point, you can try to cover that up. I mean, Zionism has done, early secular Zionism did a pretty good job of that, of like covering up the God-sized hole in Judaism with an image of the Jewish people. That was like, again, secular Zionism is radicality, but it doesn't really work. It doesn't hold over time, right? Over time, as we've seen even in Israel, secular Zionism sort of gives way back again to certain religious impulses, to certain religious understandings, to the basic notion that there's something greater than ourselves. Jewish people didn't birth themselves in Egypt, thousands of years ago, right? The Jewish people certainly didn't birth themselves in the land of Israel. Avram's not from here. We became a nation in Egypt, right? We cannot look at Judaism and put ourselves at the center. We can try to do that, but the Megillah is already showing us you can't really get away with it. Judaism doesn't make sense if you try to do that. And the way that you can do it is by cutting stuff out, but everything you cut out still leaves a hole to remind you that the story you want to tell is not quite the case it's going to be. So that's the way the Megillah subverts the secular reading. But there's also a religious reading of the Megillah. And that is, well, before I continue, any questions on that? Okay. So that's the secular reading of the Megillah and how that reading gets undermined. And again, if we had more time, I could show you, how Rosenzweig is also, expresses these same ideas. I mean, maybe I'll give it to you on one foot, actually. So Rosenzweig, in his essay called Atheistic Theology, he argues that what the Christians did to their theology in a way that essentially made it atheistic, is that Jesus was no longer the incarnation of God. Jesus was a human teacher. Jesus was a teacher who had wisdom that we could learn from, right? That was sort of the way in which Christianity became secularized. And Rosenzweig argues that the same thing happens with Judaism, that instead of, again, looking at Jesus as a human figure, right, what the Jews do is they basically get rid of God and look at the Jewish people as the central figure of the narrative, right? That we are a people like other peoples that emerged at a certain time and place, and we can sort of build Judaism around that. Now, the problem Rosenzweig notes is that the Jewish narrative doesn't really allow for that. Then when your identity is on some level a reflection of revelation, when your identity is not something you have chosen for yourself, but has been imposed on you by the outside, and that's the Jewish story, right? Jews are not Jews because we, again, emerged in a certain place and had a certain language and culture. We are Jews because God chose us, right? That is the nature of being a Jew, right? You can't really escape that, right? The famous, again, I'll use it again. The famous, what's the famous secular Zionist attempt to pretend that the Jews are just like everybody else and that we can sort of push God out of it? Well, the opening verse of the opening line of Israel's Declaration of Independence specifically says, or makes the claim, that the Jewish people emerged as a people where? What, do anybody know what it says? Where does the Jewish people emerge as a people that the Megillat Ha'atzmaut says?
Here in the land of Israel.
Right. They say Kama Am Yehudi B'Eretz Yisrael, which is so funny, right? Because like any basic reading of the Torah is like, no, that's not the case, right? The first time the Jewish people are called an Am, a people, is in Egypt, right? And the Torah, it's very important to the Torah that the Jewish people were a people first outside of Israel. They come to the land of Israel already as a people in some sense, right? That is very important for the way the Torah conceives of itself. So the Zionist attempt to, again, not make it act like our identity is, again, chosen for us, imposed on us, right? Like that our whole thing here is not something we've just sort of emerged from ourselves. It never fully holds. And that's Rosenzweig's point, that when you're a people whose identity is a reflection of being in a covenant, of being chosen, of revelation, then that dimension of an other, right, that you are not in full control of your story, right, that dimension of Judaism always comes back again, right? Like, where maybe that's not true for other religions or peoples, for the Jews, that fundamental dimension is something we can't escape. We can't pretend we emerged as a people in the land of Israel like every other people. This is just our home. We grew up here, right? We were born here. No, like our story is way more complicated than that because God was involved and we can't escape the fact that God was involved. A Jew can never claim they are absolutely native to the land of Israel, right? How do we know this? Because in a month, we're going to read the Haggadah. What do we say in the Haggadah, right? It's always striking when we read this in the Haggadah, right? We always make a point of saying, what about Avraham? That Avram was an idol worshiper, and where was our real great-great-grandfather from? Wasn't from Israel, he was from Ur Kasdim, right? We have to remind ourselves of that, even at the Seder, that we are not from here, right? That the story, our story is just way more complicated than that, and Jews can't escape that. And again, that keeps undermining the secular dimension of the reading here. So what's the religious reading, the Orthodox reading, the firm reading? Well, the Orthodox reading of Megillah, Esther, cannot tolerate the fact that God's name is not mentioned. Right, the Orthodox reading of Megillat Esther cannot tolerate the fact that the Jews in the book of Esther don't appear religious at all, right? It so bothers the Orthodox, right? What the Orthodox want to do is turn the book of Esther into like the most religious book possible. And what you see in both the Midrashim and often even in terms of like, Orthodox contemporary interpretation, there's a desire to read Mordechai and Esther as from Jews and the Jews in Persia as good religious Jews, and that God is all over the place, right? We know God is all over the place because that's the way we're supposed to experience the world, right? Something good happens to us, something bad happens to us. It's all because of God, right? That's the way we were supposed to think as Orthodox Jews, and that's the way we're going to project it onto the Megillah. So I'll give you a couple examples of this. So one of the things that the Megillah, if you read the Megillah closely, as I mentioned, there's this 3-day fast Esther and the Jewish people are going to undertake before she goes to Achashverosh. But if you look at the chronology of the Megillah, it's clear that fast, that 3-day fast, would take place during Pesach. But of course, the Megillah makes no mention of Pesach. And anybody else who's reading it, any Jews reading it, is going to say, well, wait a second, isn't this Pesach? Like, what's going on here? And so the Midrash, of course, wants to address that, right? Because if these are supposed to be good from Jews, like, why is it that they're fasting on Pesach? And here's what the Midrash says. It says, Esther said to Mordechai, she said to him, go assemble all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast on my behalf. Do not eat and do not drink for 3 days. These were the 13th, 14th, and 15th of Nisan. That's what the Midrash is pointing out, because that's the way, it's pshat. This isn't like an interpretation. But here's where it gets interpretive. He sent her in response. This is meaning when Esther tells Mordechai, we're going to fast for 3 days. It's going to be during Pesach. So Mordechai, the Midrash says, is bothered by this. He sends a response to her. But isn't the first day of Passover among those 3 days? Like, you're going to ask us to fast on Pesach? We can't do that. That's against halacha. You can't do that kind of thing. And Esther responds. She says, Elder of Israel, why is it Passover? And what it means by this, presumably, is that the needs of the moment are so great that we can fast on Passover. Meaning it's like b'koach nefesh, like we can do this, we need to do this. And then it says, immediately Mordechai heard and conceded to her contention, and that is what is written. Mordechai went and acted in accordance with everything Esther had commanded him. There they said that he violated the first day of Passover with a fast, right? So there's a religious problem that the rabbis are dealing with, and not only do they identify the religious problem, which the Megillah doesn't even identify, it also has a religious solution, right? B'koach nefesh, that's why we can fast during Pesach, and it's necessary to save Klal Yisrael. Okay, right? Again, that's the Orthodox reading. Any contradiction, we're going to wipe away. Right? And then it gives another example, that same Midrash, right, about Mordechai. And now we're told that Mordechai prays to God, right? In the moment of the decree, Mordechai is praying to God. What is Mordechai's prayer? What's Mordechai's prayer? He says, it is revealed and known before you, your throne of honor, master of the universe, that it is not due to arrogance that I did not bow to Haman, right? He's basically praying to God to explain himself. Mordechai knows all of this is because of him, and he's trying to make clear to God, it wasn't because he was arrogant. I didn't bow down because I'm arrogant. Rather, it is due to my fear of you, God, my piety, that I acted in this way and did not bow before him. It is because I feared you and did not wish to grant the honor due to you to flesh and blood, and I did not want to prostrate myself to anyone other than you. For who am I not to prostrate myself to Haman at the expense of the salvation of your people? For that I would be prepared to lick the shoes on his feet. So what again is pointing out here is that if Mordechai didn't bow down to Haman, there had to be good religious reasons for it. It couldn't be because Mordechai is arrogant, because Mordechai thinks he's better than Haman, right? It has to be there's religious reasons for it. And again, you see this throughout the interpretation of the Megillah. Jews don't look religious. Well, the rabbis are going to say they're religious. But probably the most striking feature of sort of the Orthodox interpretation is this desire to read God everywhere. God's everywhere. You don't see God's name in the Megillah? That's just because God is everywhere in the Megillah, right? We don't need God's name to know how God is present in every single moment. God's the reason that Haman hates the Jews, right? God's the reason Ahasuerus wakes up in the middle of the night. God's the reason that Haman is outside when Ahasuerus wakes up. And then Haman will tell Ahasuerus the great reward that he just wants for himself, but is ultimately going to go to Mordechai, right? Every part of the Megillah is ultimately, we see God's hand there. That's the way the Orthodox wants to read it, because that's the way the Orthodox approach wants to read the world, right? Everything is a part of God's plan. Everything has a purpose. We don't understand it right now, but someday we will. We have to have faith, right? God is here, right? We know this. And again, even in the 20th century, even in the modern period, right, we still see this, and sometimes even do it more with historical events, right? You look at the history of Israel, War of Independence, Six-Day War, right? As we all know, God did not appear from the heavens and reveal God's self to the Jewish people in the world during those wars or those events. But that doesn't stop us from looking at them and saying, well, God was there. God was present in this, and God was present in that, and the Jewish people's return to the land of Israel, it's all about God's plan. Again, the problem with this approach is that it's presented with a sense of obviousness, right? That you just look at it and this is the only way you must be able to interpret it. And this is where we get into the fundamental problem of the Orthodox approach, because as we know, you can read the book of Esther and it makes complete sense if God has nothing to do with it, right? Again, we know the events that take place. People hate the Jews because they're different. That's the modern Jewish experience, right? People want to kill the Jews, right? They want to kill them en masse. We know that's the modern Jewish experience. And yet the Jewish people are able to take risks, take initiative, show solidarity, and defend themselves and survive, right? We know that's also the modern Jewish experience. And none of that is ultimately dependent on God, right? There is a purely secular interpretation that is available for all of those events. And that is what is so bothersome to the Orthodox reading, is the Megillah makes sense without God, right? That, the heroes are Mordechai and Esther. and everything they were willing to risk. And again, is the story implausible? A little bit, but implausible things happen, right? There have been more implausible things to happen in the history of the Jewish people than the book of Esther. I guarantee you that, right? But it happened. And again, the challenge with the Orthodox reading is to want to say it's all because of God, when clearly you have no right to do that. You have no right to do that because God's name doesn't appear, and people are acting purely of their own accord, right? That is very, very clear. So if the secular reading wants to read this as a book that has nothing to do with God, the Orthodox reading wants to see this as a book in which God is at the center, right? Again, remember I said before, the secular reading puts the Jewish people at the center. The Orthodox reading puts this like idol of God at the center. We're going to say, okay, where's God? We can show you exactly where God is. We're going to be able to point to it. That's what an idol gives you. We can point to, there's God in the Megillah. But what's fascinating is that the Megillah is the most authentic version of Jewish theology that we have. Because if, again, secular Judaism puts the Jewish people in the middle and Orthodoxy puts the idol of God in the middle, what does the Megillah put in the middle, right? The Megillah puts in the middle an empty space, right? Because God's not there. But it also seems to point to something more at the same time, right? And that's what makes it such a subversive text for us as modern Jews, because it doesn't allow us to sit in either position, the Orthodox position or the Reform/secular position. It challenges both of them, and it asks us to live with a very, very difficult and profound contradiction. So let me, with the time that we have, I want to play out this contradiction in Rosenzweig a bit. The fact that God is not there, but at the same time, we can experience God is there. And what does that mean, and why that is so profoundly difficult for us? Because this gets exactly what the Megillah is all about. And in Rosenzweig, I would say this is very much central to his whole way of thinking. So in the Star of Redemption, he has a piece where he talks about how we are supposed to relate to God or divine providence, right? Again, the traditional notion of divine providence is that everything happens for a reason. And, again, even if this isn't said, openly all the time, there's always this assumption that, again, good people get rewarded, bad people get punished. Hard to escape that sensibility as religious human beings, whether you're Jewish or not. And Rosenzweig is in this piece from the Star is going to grapple with this whole question of whether or not it's really can ever be so obvious that God is present or God is involved with the world. And here's what he says. He says a rabbinic, and this is his story of Purim right here, his version of it. He says a rabbinic legend tells the tale of a river in a faraway land that is so pious that it stops flowing on the Shabbat. Right? There's, I think in the Zohar or maybe even in Chazal, there's the idea of a place where Jews live, where there's a river. And what's so special about this Jewish community is very holy and pious and frum. And not only are the Jews there holy and pious and frum, but the river is holy, pious, and frum. And how do we know the river is so religious, so Orthodox? Because the river stops flowing on Shabbat. River doesn't do malacha. Jews don't do malacha. River doesn't do malacha, right? Amazing thing. We might think that's the ideal, right? That reality itself should conform to our religious expectations in the most basic and obvious fashion. Shouldn't that be the religious ideal? Don't we imagine in the world to come that even the rivers are going to stop flowing on Shabbos? Isn't that something we would want to see in the here and now? So here's what Rosenzweig says. He says, if instead of the Main, he's referring to the river in Frankfurt in Germany, if instead of the Main, it was this river that flowed through Frankfurt, meaning if in Frankfurt there was a river that stopped flowing on Shabbat, he says there is no doubt that the whole Jewish community there would strictly observe the Shabbat. Right? He says, you know what? If there was a river that stopped flowing in Frankfurt every Shabbat, all the Jews in Frankfurt would be frum. All the Jews in Frankfurt would be the frumest Jews you've ever seen before, right? Because they would have this natural, obvious validation of God's will, God's word, in the most profound way possible, right? So they'd all would have to be frum. They'd say, wow, God is real. We know what God wants. We got to do this. But here's Rosenzweig's point. We don't ever live in a world in which the river stops flowing on Shabbat. Right. And that, by the way, is the very world of the Megillah. Right. If the world of the Megillah was one in which the river stops flowing on Shabbat, then God should appear in a mighty revelation and make clear to Achashverosh, Haman, Mordechai, and Esther exactly what the story is here. Right. But as he says, our version of reality, the one we live in as Jews, modern Jews, but already, again, certainly going back to Esther, God does not give such signs. Obviously, for Rosenzweig says, God shudders at the inevitable result. There's a reason God doesn't stop the river on Shabbos. There's a reason God didn't give us a revealed miracle in the Megillah. Because then precisely the least free, the most fearful, and the weakest would be the most pious. And God obviously wants only those who are free for his own. So what's Rosenzweig's point here? Rosenzweig's point is if you stop the river on Shabbat, then everybody is going to be from. And not just maybe everybody is going to be from. Who are the people that are going to be jumping to be from the most from? Are the people who are most willing to submit to God because they see God as a manifestly higher power, right? Like they see God as so powerful, God stops the river, therefore we should need to worship him. It is not a religiosity that is free. It is a religiosity that is compelled, right? Because people see the power behind it. And Rosenzweig's point is that God does not want the worship of slaves. And again, as I keep saying, that is, again, what we're grappling with in Esther. If Esther wanted the worship, if God wanted the worship of slaves in the Esther story, God would basically make God's self fully appear, right? It's the very fact that the Jews are willing to somehow see more in their experiences in the story, while God is absent, that actually makes it a truly religious moment, right? We've talked about this before, famous Gemara at Har Sinai. It's as if God held the mountain over the Jewish people's heads and said, receive the Torah or die or be crushed under the mountain. And the rabbis say, well, if the Jews had the Torah forced on them, then the Jewish people have a good excuse why they shouldn't be held responsible if they violate the Torah. But then the Gemara says, you know what, though? The Jewish people did have the moment where they freely accepted the Torah. They accepted it in the time of Purim, in the time of Esther, because they basically established this new holiday for themselves, which in the rabbis, again, is understood as a moment where the Jewish people recognize God's presence, God's, behind the scenes, even though, again, the river doesn't stop for them, right? It is a moment of freedom on some level, that they are able to choose and recognize God when they don't have to. Because again, when we look at the center of the circle, right, God's not there. We may see things that make us think there's more going on to the story. That's important, but we never are able to have this moment where we can just point and say, oh, there's God, right? There's God. And for Rosenzweig, as we'll see in a moment too, miracles never function in that way. The miracles are never, except maybe, Har Sinai, are never a moment in which everybody can point and say, okay, there's God. We know exactly what's going on here. So here's what Rosenzweig says. He says, but in order to, what's the problem here? In order to discern between free men and slavish souls, the mere invisibility of his rule is hardly sufficient. It's not enough that if God wants to tell who really wants to worship him, it's not enough that God is invisible, that God is absent, right? Or God appears absent. That's not enough, right? For the fearful ones are fearful enough to prefer, when in doubt, to take the path, which in any case does not hurt and will even possibly with a 50-50 chance be useful. Meaning, even if God's absent, there are still a lot of people that are willing to be from. Why is it that a lot of people are willing to be from even if God's absent? Because they'll say to themselves, this is a reference to Pascal's wager, a famous philosopher's point, that like, okay, we're not sure God exists or God doesn't. But you know what? It's better to act as if God exists. Because if you die and you go up to Shemaim and you found out God exists and you never worship God, you're going to be in for a very rough time. So better in this world to act a little religious, even if you're not sure, 50-50, you don't really know, because at least then when you die for eternity, everything will be okay, right? So Rosenzweig's point here is that it's not enough that God's absent or appears absent, because even then still people will be from. Therefore, God has to go another level. Therefore, in order to separate the wheat from the chaff, God must not only be advantageous, he must be absolutely damaging, right? We have to live in a world that doesn't just look like God's not there, but actually we experience this just as if it's not even possible God exists. He says, therefore, in order to separate the wheat, read that. So he has no choice. He must tempt man. Not only must he hide his ruling from him, he must even deceive him about it. He must make it difficult for him and even possible to see it, so that man may have the opportunity to believe in him and to trust in him truly. That is in freedom. We live in a world where it's not just that we don't need God to explain things. We live in a world in which it seems that like it often functions the opposite of the way God is supposed to have intended it. All right. And it's only because the possibility of God is so impossible that we can be religious in any kind of truly free sense. And as Rosenzweig goes on to say, he says, a person must learn to believe in his freedom. You must believe that God, before God, it is without limits, even if it is perhaps limited everywhere else. God's commandment itself, engraved on stone tablets, must be for him according to the untranslatable wordplay of the ancients. Freedom on the tablets, famous rabbinic drush. Chirut ala luchot, charut ala luchot. Al tikra charut ala luchot, ele chirut ala luchot. Right, that the tablets themselves represent freedom. Everything it says there, everything is in God's hands, except for one thing, the fear of God. Freedom is foundational to our relationship to God. We are bound to God in ways that we don't fully understand, but the way we choose to acknowledge that relationship is ultimately a free act. God calls to us. We feel pulled by God's call, but it's up to us whether we choose to answer. It's always up to us whether we choose to answer, right? Even if we still feel compelled. Just like, as I've used many times, your spouse, your loved one calls to you, you know they want something, you feel the pull of that, you feel it maybe on your heartstrings, but it's up to you whether you're willing to respond, right? That's the freedom. And that freedom, Rosenzweig argues here, is only possible if we live in a world in which, God's name is not present, where it's not obvious, where we can explain things otherwise, where we have to recognize that ultimately, right, faith on some level requires a free choice. Let me then switch. So this is the critique of the Orthodox reading, right? Orthodox wants to say Megillah is full of God, God's all over the place, right? Rosenzweig is saying, no, God's not there. And in truth, God's not ever there, not in a way we can ever fully explain or justify. But that is ultimately because our connection to God, relationship to God, has to be free. Again, I don't want to say freely chosen, or I guess I should say freely responded to. Right, God calls even in God's absence, and it's up to us whether we choose to respond to that. Right, that's the challenge of the Megillah to the Orthodox perspective. To the secular perspective, right, the challenge of the Megillah is the other end, which we've been speaking about, and that is that on some level we believe that there's a miracle that takes place here. There's a miracle in the Megillah. So the problem with saying that there's a miracle in the Megillah is that we normally understand miracles like we said before. Right, the river stops on Shabbat. Right. The Red Sea splits, right? The plagues happen. We expect miracles to be sort of supernatural, beyond explanation, and that's exactly how we know they're miracles. But Rosenzweig also writes extensively about one of the major shifts that happens in the modern period is that anything can be given an explanation, that there is no such thing in a sense as a supernatural event, that things that are truly exceptional can always be explained after the fact. So what do I mean by this? So I'm going to here where it says 92 poems, the second source on the page. So this is Rosenzweig's critique of again, sort of the secular perspective. That says we can understand the story. It's a story of Jewish solidarity. We've got great heroes, Mordechai and Esther, like we have great heroes today of Ben Gurion and Trumpeldor, right? We can understand it without God having anything to do with it. There's no miracles here. It's the Jewish people taking their destiny into their own hands. But that's not the way miracles work. So here's what he says. He says, the question why today miracles no longer happen as they once used to happen is sheer foolishness. If you think, there used to be miracles, but now we don't have any anymore, right? That's a mistake. Miracles never happened at all. The past is a murderous atmosphere for the miracle. The Bible itself explains the miracle of the Red Sea after the fact as natural. Right, so what's fascinating, Rosenzweig points out, is even the miracle of the Red Sea, which we might think is the example of the supernatural miracle. That's the moment when the river stops flowing. But Rosenzweig points out that the Torah doesn't actually describe it that way. What the Torah says, if you're familiar with Parshat B'Shalach, is that Moses raises his staff, and what happens? Right, a wind comes and blows the waters to such an extent that they are now separating. Right, even the Torah itself offers a naturalistic explanation for the miracle, which Rosenzweig's point is that every miracle on a certain level can always be explained. Like there's always a justification or reason you can find for it, right? He says after the fact, every miracle can be explained, right? After you read Esther, you can say, well, wait a second, human beings taking their initiative, taking their power into their own hands. Not because the miracle was not a miracle, but because the explanation is an explanation. Here's his point. The explanation doesn't have to be a good one. It just has to be an explanation. And then it's enough to make us not think that miracles are real. He says the miracle always stands in the present, perhaps in the future. One can ask for and experience it. And as long as the present of the experience lasts, one can be thankful. Right? To experience a miracle is to experience that which is fundamentally exceptional, right? That which we think to be impossible, right? It doesn't mean that it's supernatural, but it does mean that we think it is impossible. And that is exactly what happens in Esther. The impossible happens. Right? Persia is the most powerful kingdom in the world. Haman is the second most powerful person in Persia. When Haman decides he wants to kill the Jews and Ahasuerus signs the decree, that story is only supposed to end in one way. The fact that it didn't end that way, the fact that there was a series of events that enabled it to be different, events in which individuals had to take it upon themselves to do the impossible. Esther had to say, I am willing to give my life for the Jewish people. She says, if I go to Ahasuerus now and I'm not supposed to, he can kill me, right? And Esther knows if she doesn't say anything, if she doesn't do anything, nobody knows she's Jewish. She's going to be scot-free here. She's going to be okay. She does the impossible. She risks her life when she doesn't have to try to save the Jewish people. People don't do that. Most of the time, people don't risk their lives for anything, and they certainly don't risk their lives when they're going to be okay. But that is exactly what we see take place here, right? That the impossible happens, and the recognition when the impossible happens to us in the moment, we experience it as miraculous. And the challenge is being open to that possibility. Secular person isn't open to miracles. They're not open to the fact that the impossible happens. When the impossible happens, 5 minutes later, they give reasons for it. They explain it away, right?
Can't hear you.
Did we lose the sound?
Yes, we did.
Yeah. Zach, we lost your sound suddenly at the punchline.
Yeah.
No. Oh, we don't, I don't know what happened, but we don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened. I don't know where you lost me. I'm so sorry. All I was saying is that the Megillah subverts our fundamental attempt to stay in the Orthodox position or the secular position. It's not a book where God is all over the place. God is absent. The book can be fundamentally explained without God, but it's also not a book in which God has no role or possibility whatsoever, right? To say that, you basically have to cut out all the religious piece that we know intrinsically it has to be there for the book to make sense. It represents this idea that we as Jews ultimately can never point to God, that faith is ultimately a free act on some level. On the other hand, it's a book that also pushes us to be open to the possibility of miracles, to the possibility of the impossible, to having a moment in which we are just confronted by that which we do not understand and that which we do not know, but to recognize its transformative impact on us nonetheless. So, and I don't want to take any more time because we're already a few minutes past, but if anybody has any questions, I have a minute or two more.
I made a comment. Could you just look at the second comment of mine? Forget the first.
Thinking that we have free choice, but like in the Shema, we are punished if we don't obey.
No,
So
the second one.
Right. So no. Oh, the second one. Hold on.
Yeah.
I've always had a problem that in order for the Jews not to be killed, they couldn't renege on the law. So the Jews were allowed to preempt and kill thousands of people. So that's like a whole nother shia. Like why?
Yeah,
that's
violence creating violence.
Right. So what I will say is that the Jews don't want to have to use violence, right? They don't. That's very clear. How do we know they don't want to have to use violence? Because they ask Ahasuerus to overrule the law, right? That's not, they're not thinking to themselves, oh, here's our moment to go get our enemies, right? They're thinking, can we just end this? When that is not a possibility, they take up violence in self-defense, right? To me, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine any religious book making the claim that people don't have a right to defend themselves when others come to kill them. Again, we can debate, why are people still attacking if the Jews if they know the Jews can defend themselves, right? Do they really hate the Jews, right? The violence is not a simple thing to understand, but I think at the very least, we have to recognize that the Jewish people are not like glorifying violence here in the sense that they want to just go kill their enemies. That is, they make clear that's not what they want to do. That's what they're kind of forced to do. I will say this though, and again, what makes clear with the violence there is that part of the way we know the violence is not being glorified in the same sense, and this is again pushes the secular reading wants to glorify violence because it glorifies human power, and again, even religious people will say this, but it's really a secular reading because it glorifies human power. That if we just smash our enemies to bits, we're going to be okay, right? But part of the way the Megillah undermines that reading, sort of that reading, which is unfortunately all too common today, is the very fact that even though the Jews use all the violence that they can to defend themselves, the Megillah does not end with the Jewish people being free. Chazal are very clear, and it's also very clear at the end of the Megillah, the Jews end the Megillah being slaves to Achashverosh. So what the Megillah is also reminding us is that violence may be necessary for self-defense, but it absolutely in no way guarantees, our honor or our freedom, right? Because the Jews are slaves at the end. And I think that's a fundamental lesson. People think with
I
enough
didn't know
violence,
that.
enough power, Jews will be free. That's not the way it works, right? Like there's no, it just not even from an ethical perspective, but even more so, right? Even if the government did everything the most extreme right wanted within Israel today, do we think that Israel's problems would be fine? No, the moment Israel did something that was truly horrific, half the world would intervene, right? Like you just saw what happened in Ukraine. Like you think that that's not going to happen here, right? Like again, the assumption that there's always somebody more powerful. That's the lesson that Jews have also learned, right? Doesn't matter how powerful the Jews think they are. There's always an Achashverosh. There's always an America. There's always a Russia. There's always a China. Power alone does not effectuate, what we want here. And I think the Megillah also gets at that implicitly. Maybe we'd like it to be more foregrounded, but it's definitely there.
Okay,
All right.
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Zach.
So we'll have 2 more sessions, and have a Purim Sameach.
Purim Sameach. We actually have Renee, who is outside of Jerusalem, so her Purim is tonight and tomorrow.
Enjoy.
that's right.
Enjoy.
Rosh Hashanah.
All right. Be well, everybody. And
Thank you.
next week in person. Next week in person.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Everyone's invited to Morocco.
Okay. We look forward to
Have a
the
wonderful
pictures,
trip.
Eric.
Chag Sameach.
Like Sameach.